Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Vibe Podcast, and today I'm joined by Professor David Trobisch. And today we're going to be discussing Paul's letters. Do any of them, or can any of the texts in them, trace back to a historical Paul? When did they first emerge? And what is the connection between them and Marcion of Sinope? It's good to have you back on the show, David.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me back. This way, I have the feeling I didn't offend you the last time, and so hopefully we'll
Oh
be
no,
we'll
you
be
didn't
doing
offend me at
well.
all.
Um, uh, I've I really enjoy very much the questions, the way you have them, the way you phrase them, a little unorthodox. Did Paul really exist? It's not a question that you ask every, that's not a traditional question in exegesis, and that is exactly the problem. And if you don't mind, I would like to present how I would go about answering such a question. Yeah, so methodologically, there's no use if I tell you yes or no or such a thing if you don't know why I feel that way, why I argue that way as a scholar. And as you've also shown in other podcasts, that you're very much aware of the Marcionite edition, which is a specific edition, and this is really the clue for the question about the historical Paul, how you assess the historical value of that particular um, publication in antiquity. And so I would like to talk about the Marcion edition before, just to give viewers who may never have heard anything about it a little bit of an overview what the discussion is. And then I will answer the question about whether Paul actually existed. um, well, the Marcionite edition consists of 10 letters of Paul and of one gospel book. Nevertheless, we don't know too much about it because no manuscripts of the Marcionite edition have survived. Nevertheless, readers critically discuss the Gospel book in so much detail that it can be reconstructed with a high degree of scholarly consensus. The text of the letters, however, is not attested very well. So, of the 10 letters of Paul, we do not have as good a record from readers who read that book in the second century as we have about the Gospel. So, um, how do you go about literature if something like that happens? And then the best way to interpret fragmentary elements in any kind of literature really is to let the context interpret. The letters of Paul in the Marcionite edition are not transmitted just as a collection of letters of Paul, but they're always transmitted together with a gospel. And so, if you want to know something about this part of the collection, the letters, and you have another book that comes with it, the gospel, it will help you interpret and answer the questions. Who is Paul? What is the role in it? What kind of story is told? Because every collection also tells a story. It is not simply an assembly of individual documents, but these documents were put together by editors to present a specific narrative. Editors of collections create a narrative context in which whatever they present to the readers makes sense. So the scholarly consensus assumes that the title of the gospel book that was part of the Marcionite edition was simply gospel, euangelion. So not gospel according to something or something like that, just euangelion. When you look at the letters of Paul, the first letter presented in the collection of Paul's letters is a letter to Galatians. And in the first passage of this letter, Paul denounces the authority of any other gospel book. In no uncertain words, Paul expresses his disgust at anyone who might turn, quote, to a different gospel than, quote, what you received. Even if, I quote again, we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, let that one be accursed. So the editorial narrative of the Marcion edition presents its gospel book as the only acceptable one, denouncing all others as fakes. So let's talk briefly about the gospel. What does that look like, the Marcionite gospel? The first and the last sentences of the Marcionite gospel provide a rather simple frame. Jesus enters the story without further introduction as he goes down to Capernaum, and he leaves from Jerusalem at the end of the book. I'm reading the very first sentence of the Marcionite gospel to you now. In the 15th year of the reign of Emperor Tiberius, Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee at the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. So the beginning of Jesus' public presence is clearly dated to, quote, the 15th year of the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius was installed by the Senate in Rome on September 18, the year of 14, indicating to educated readers that the story of Jesus, according to this gospel, begins between September 29 and September of the year 30. So it's very clearly dated in the very first sentence. Now, the story of this gospel ends on the Sunday following Passover when the resurrected Christ leaves Jerusalem. There's no year given for that particular event. So the story does not cover the whole life of Jesus. There's nothing about birth narrative or childhood or anything like that, but it just covers a section of Jesus' life. And when you read it literally, which, literature is called literature, because you allow yourself to listen to a narrator, you trust them, and only this way can you enjoy Star Wars or something like that. If you say, this could not have happened, let's not read it anymore, you're already out of the picture. So literal reading is actually a very scholarly reading when it comes to literature. So this story of Jesus could cover as little as 6 months, because between September and the Passover of the next year, that's the smallest amount of time. The book itself does not give you any more clues. Yeah, it's not like in the Gospel of John, where for 3 times he goes to the Passover. Then it must be at least 3 years. No, it could just be 6 months. It could also be 5 years. Yeah, we really don't know. So although there are no stories about what Jesus did before he arrived in Capernaum, the anonymous narrator informs readers that Jesus grew up in Nazareth, and he is referred to once as Jesus the Nazarene. We get more information. His father is called Joseph, and in one episode his mother and his brothers are mentioned, but no names are given. We also receive the information that Jesus lived in Capernaum. The stories follow each other in an episodic fashion. Jesus travels in the region but always returns to Capernaum. And then, at some point in the story, he begins to travel toward Jerusalem, where he dies and where he appears to his followers as the resurrected Christ. This is so the frame of the story. We'll now concentrate on his time in Jerusalem. Jesus comes to Jerusalem and teaches regularly in the temple. Readers are informed that, quote, the day of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near. So for the first time, you get a little bit of a sense. There's an event in the year, so we're probably talking about spring here, or certainly talking about spring. And a few sentences later, the readers are told, quote, the day of Passover came on which the Passover lamb had to be slaughtered. So the mention of Passover and the Passover celebration provides a timeline for his time in Jerusalem. The other point in time that readers receive in this gospel is that Jesus is crucified the day following the Passover dinner on a Friday. The story ends with the discovery of the empty tomb the following Sunday morning. So he dies on Friday or Saturday, and then Sunday morning is when he's resurrected, or the discovery of the empty tomb. Let's be more careful. On that day, Jesus appears twice. once in the afternoon and once in the evening. And then, quote, he departed from them late Sunday night from Bethany. So even the town is mentioned where this happened. To read you just the very last sentence in the reconstruction and translation of Matthias Klinghardt to give you a sense of how this gospel ends. But he led them out to Bethany. He led the disciples out to Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And it happened when he blessed them that he departed from them. And they returned to Jerusalem full of joy, and they praised God at all times. If you're very literal, he departed from them. He went away. It's just not an ascension or so. It is just a regular word. So Jesus, in this gospel, comes down to Capernaum, is in Capernaum in Jerusalem, and then he passes and goes on again. That's what the text is. Yeah? So the narrative perspective of this gospel book is a perspective of an authoritative, omniscient narrator. This is not a perspective of, like, say, an eyewitness or so. I was there, I saw Jesus, and he said this. No. There's someone who knows everything, doesn't give you all the details, yeah, just decides what he wants to say. And this perspective, this narrative perspective, is consistent with the messaging of the editorial narrative of the Marcionite edition. So how the editors put the material together, because they say that Paul had not written this gospel book. He only, quote from 1 Corinthians 15, he only handed on what he in turn had received. Yeah? So this book fits exactly to what Paul is talking about in Galatians. There's really only one, yeah? And I received it. I didn't write it. So that is the basic frame of the editorial narrative. When you apply the rule now, let the context interpret. So what does this gospel then say about Paul? Well, first of all, Paul's letters stand next to the gospel and he references it directly, so they belong together. So when we now look at the letters of Paul under this slide, the following thing happens. The sequence of the letters of Paul in the Marcionite edition are as follows. The first letter that is presented to the readers is the letter to Galatians. It is then followed by two letters to Corinthians, by one letter to Romans, two letters to Thessalonians, and a letter each to Laodiceans, Colossians, Philippians, and to Philemon. So if you count them, there are 10 letters. These letters are arranged chronologically. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to understand that editors of a letter collection would want to present them chronologically. This is probably what 9 out of 10 people would do automatically without any kind of instruction. And this is exactly the kind of order that we find in the Marcionite edition. These letters tell a story, and the story covers roughly 12 months. It takes the readers, in letter to Galatians, it takes the readers from Damascus to Rome. That's the overall trip that Paul makes within 12 months. The plot of this story is driven by the conflict between Paul and his rivals, the disciples of Jesus and the brothers of Jesus. So a letter to Galatians sets the stage by explaining that Paul traveled from Damascus to Jerusalem, where Jesus' brother James and Jesus' disciple John and Peter asked him to raise money for the poor in Jerusalem. So first thing readers read, actually the very first chapter, is that Paul travels to Jerusalem and that he has a meeting with Peter, John, and James being the brother of Jesus. And the outcome of this is that they can convince him, persuade them, force him, whatever you want to use, to raise money for the poor in Jerusalem. Whatever that term exactly means is, interestingly enough, not completely explained in the letters. It could just be people who have no money, who are poor, but it could also be a self-designation. There's a quote in the Talmud that seems to read it that way, a self-designation of the leadership in Jerusalem. Jesus proclaiming, that you should not you should share all your belongings, and so you should not try to become richer. So would make sense that they call themselves that way. We really don't know, but we know that Paul committed to it from in this story from the letter to the Galatians. So what we also learn here is that conflicting parties meet, and what these parties are: the brothers of Jesus. In this case, only James is mentioned, but in 1 Corinthians it says the brothers in plural, and we know that Jesus has 4 brothers from other traditional sources or such and such. So the other brothers are not mentioned in this case, but it's more than one brother. Shortly after this meeting in Jerusalem, Paul clashes with Peter in Antioch. And now the conflict between Peter and Paul is built up. This is really about this. For every story, in order to move the plot, you need to have a conflict. And a conflict is a situation in the narrative world where you have 2 parties where, if it's really well written, usually the readers can understand that both of them are right, but they cannot come together. They cannot agree. But you can understand one side, you can understand the other side. This is why modern film dialogue is extremely important, because with every dialogue you switch perspectives. So when you analyze stories, looking for conflict helps very much in understanding how the plot is constructed and why you really want to know how it continues. You could also call it a theme. The conflict between Peter and Paul is something that on another level might actually have political consequences. If you read that from a 4th century perspective, for example, Peter really much looks like the Pope, and Paul looks like something else. So, and there it becomes more thematic than actual historical or something like that. So now this was Galatians. They are followed in a collection by the 2 letters to Corinthians, who document how Paul's fundraising campaign was sabotaged by the hostile followers of what he calls the super apostles, which are Peter and the brothers of Jesus, who are explicitly mentioned in the 1st letter to the Corinthians, and they are referenced in the 2nd letter as super apostles. As Paul made his way from Antioch via Ephesus and Macedonia to Corinth, these letters cover, 1st and 2nd Corinthians cover this trip. So to just read them at face value again, you see how Paul travels from Antioch, where the falling out with Peter, gets to Ephesus, and then crosses the water, goes to Macedonia, in this case Thessaloniki, and Philippi, and then through Athens goes to Corinth. This is nicely told. From Corinth, then, Paul's own words in the Marcionite edition, he sends a letter to Romans, and he sends 2 letters to the Thessalonians. Paul writes the remaining 4 letters, the one to the Laodiceans, to Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon, from captivity in Rome. I'm doing a little bit of difficulty. I could just say that he writes the letter to the Romans, but this is not what he does, because what we have in the Canonical Edition is an edited version of what the Marcionite edition presented. That has actually 2 more chapters, and so on and so forth, than the letter to the Romans in the Marcionite edition probably had. So if I say the letter to the Colossians was written there, you still have to think this is not the Colossians that we're familiar with when we read the New Testament, but it is probably an earlier form. This is what we'll have to talk about later. If you follow this storyline, you get Paul from Damascus through Rome, through Asia Minor, through Greece to Rome. And you know that it took about a year, because he gives time in the letters. Actually, you see, well, you get a timeline that is for everyone who wants to look for it. He will see it, or she will see it. So the trip took about 1 year, and the story is open-ended. In the Marcionite edition, the conflict between Peter and Paul remains unresolved, which for stories makes them more interesting. But for a church, this is unbearable. You can't have two people who are right, if you only have one God. So the trip is presented rather straightforward. It is only one trip, and it only covers a period of about 12 months in the life of Paul. In the 2nd century, when Paul's letters are read as part of the Marcionite edition, Paul the Apostle becomes a role model for readers who never met Jesus of Nazareth and who base their identity exclusively on a spiritual experience of Christ. 150 years after Jesus died, no one can come and claim, I was there, I saw it, and this is what he said. So the readers can identify with Paul much more than they could identify with someone like Peter who saw Jesus. Yeah. So like Paul, readers only know of Jesus through literature. In his letters, Paul explains that Christ was sent by his Father, died as Jesus on the cross, and returned to heaven, from where he shall return soon to judge the living and the dead. This is what Paul knows about Jesus and what he says. Experiencing Christ supersedes experiencing Jesus. Paul is more important than Peter. Christianity is born. Yeah, it's not called the Jesus movement. It's called the Christ movement because Christ is the spiritual side of, and Jesus is the human side of this phenomenon of this movement. So the theme in this story of the letters of Paul in the Marcionite edition is really the conflict between Peter and Paul. Peter, historical Jesus; Paul, the Spirit and Christ. So Jesus versus Christ. It addresses a 2nd century situation where the experience of Christ simply replaces the experience of Jesus. And we have plenty of other writings during this period that pick up this conflict and talk about it. One of the clearest one, my point of view, is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where she says, yeah, you, Peter, I know you want to organize the church. It probably stands politically already for an organization of the early Catholic community. But she says, why should I be right? Why should I be wrong? And then she argues, because I had a vision. Yeah. Do you think I'm lying to you? Isn't the vision just as close to what God wants us than someone who saw Jesus and may have misunderstood what he said? Yeah. So exactly this conflict. Can a vision, an experience, a spiritual experience, be just as true as something that Jesus said historically? So this is 2nd century thinking. You have to work that through. And if you're honest to yourself, of course, the Christian in the 21st century has no access to Jesus either. If there's any access at all from a religious point of view, it will be a spiritual one. So the Marcionite edition tells its story by selecting 10 letters of Paul, giving them titles, arranging them in a specific order, and publishing them alongside the Gospel book. The protagonist of the plot is Paul. The antagonists are the disciples of Jesus and the brother of Jesus. Just as a gospel book only covers a limited period in Jesus' life, the letters also only cover a limited period in Paul's life. And now comes the reflection that will lead us to the historical question. The editorial narrative is not a historical assessment. When you read literature, anything that you read in literature can be historically true, and it can just be product of the imagination. We call it poetic license. We can tell stories about the future, like Star Wars. Or we can retell stories about the past, and we know a historian will be upset. They say, this is not what happened. Who cares? Yeah, Monty Python, yeah, and Life of Brian, yeah. He quotes the Bible all the time. And, well, that's not what happened, yeah. Well, who knows, really? But you see, with what I'm trying to say is literature, just because someone says something in a book does not mean that it happened that way. This is an absolute, very simple assessment, and unfortunately, human tendency is, if it's in the Bible, it's historical. It must have happened. It's no absolutely no reason why it must have happened just because someone tells a story. And that is, of course, also true for the editorial narrative of this collection. So one should not assume that any publisher would publish any letters without editorial changes. I wrote my dissertation on letter collections in antiquity and looked really at every letter collection that was published between 300 BC and 300 CE. And it's just very clear that the genre is just like a modern genre. If a president publishes letters he wrote during his period as a politician, of course the publisher will have to have say in it and say, well, do you really need to have the greetings to your little daughter for her 15th birthday in there and how much popcorn she ate? No, we don't need that. This is not why So every letter collection that is published is not identical with the kind of text that was in the mailbox. A letter in an edited collection may reflect a historical letter, but it also may be fictitious. No editorial narrative should be taken as historically reliable without independent confirmation. You can check literature by checking historical sources, yeah, but literature in itself is not enough to say whether it is historical or not. You need to be able to check that. One of my my examples where it became so clear to me. So when you read Kafka, Kafka describes trip to New York in his book, and the first scene is that the ship goes into the harbor in New York, and there is this statue, and she's there with a sword in fire. No? Now, the historian would say that's not true. The Statue of Liberty doesn't have a sword in fire. No, but the angel outside of the paradise does have one. And so by telling the story that way, someone who is immersed in biblical imagery gets the message. What he's trying to say is those people have the feeling they're entering paradise. Human beings were kicked out, yeah, and now they're entering paradise again. And in some way, the poet Kafka in this way actually pretty well reflects the identity of this new country. They have to find a national identity, although they come from everywhere and they hate nothing more than immigrants, and they don't realize they're immigrants themselves, so because they're going back into a paradise in their mind, yeah. And you can stand to it how you want, you can like it, not like it, but it is a way of doing that. So no one will. I think most people will agree that Kafka is an artist, is a poet, is a good writer, and so and he's saying something with that. So if you twist historical facts and you find out as a historian that the historical facts are told differently in this story, you actually have something to interpret. Why is that the case? Yeah, it could just be a mistake, but it doesn't have to be. They probably have a message that they want to get across. So also the historical accuracy of the letters of the gospel or the gospel book cannot be assessed. The message of the historical publisher is easy to grasp. The publisher of the Marcionite edition told readers three things, in my opinion, as an interpreter. One, that a certain Paul was the author of the letters. He makes very clear these letters are written by a person whose name is Paul. Second, that the selection, title, and arrangement of the letters reflected Paul's intentions. As the editor of a letter collection will not necessarily want to abuse the author that they're publishing, letting him say things that he doesn't want to say, but he presents it as if this is really what Paul wanted to say. The author of the letter wanted to express it that way. Going back to Galatians, the fight with Peter. Then in, let's say, Philippians is a wonderful text to say there are Christians out there that are really happy that we're in prison, yeah, and but we have to live with it, such and such. Well, it's Peter, it's the other side, yeah. They're happy that Paul is in prison in Rome. Wow, that's quite a story. Now that's the Marcionite edition story. Then, so certain Paul wrote the letter, that the letters are presented, the letters of Paul, and arranged in a way that they reflect Paul's overall message. This is how the editors understood Paul's case. This is how they present the story. And the third thing they want to get across is that the gospel book was the one Paul had received and promoted. So it is older than Paul. You may call it the Gospel of Paul, but don't misunderstand it as something that Paul wrote. Yeah, but it is the gospel that he received, and this is why it is his gospel. This is what they want to get across. In the New Covenant, as if the title of the Marcionite edition was actually New Testament, which, one would probably better translate it as a new covenant that God makes with the world. In the New Covenant was the title of the Marcionite edition. If this is the case, as some scholars have suggested, it reflected Paul's remark that he, the main contributing author to the collection, and his associates are ministers of a new covenant, or, servants of the New Testament. Let me quote from 2 Corinthians, where he uses this language. Not that we, so Paul and his associates, not that we are competent of ourselves to claim anything as coming from us. Our competence is from God, who has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of letter, but of spirit. For the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. When you read a book that is called New Testament, and then you see that Paul says himself he's a server of the New Testament, it makes complete sense, and you think of the book that you're actually reading, or the Marcionite edition had the title New Testament. When Paul states that he passed on the gospel book that he had received, the letters function as an endorsement of God's call to publishing it. In his own words, God enabled Paul and his followers, which certainly includes the publisher of the Marcionite edition, hopefully also its readers, to the ministry of promoting the gospel book, the book called Gospel. Yeah. So the function of the letters of Paul, among other functions, also theological, Christ replaces Jesus. But one of the functions is to endorse this gospel book. So you can't take it away because, this is one of the functions of the letters of Paul in this context. So the full title of the Marcionite edition, therefore, could be paraphrased as New Covenant according to Paul. So this is how Paul sees what Jesus is all about, what Christ is all about. And now the question, so I'm really talking not about the New Testament as we read it, but about this Marcionite edition. It also had the title New Testament. So, okay, how much of that is historically true? How do you deal with it as a historian? Historically, all we know of Paul came to us through the Marcionite edition of his letters. We have no other sources about Paul. This is not like this is a historical person who's mentioned by 3-4 people and we have a document where he bought a piece of bread or something like that. No, we have nothing. All we have is the Marcionite edition that presents letters from the name of Paul, who's otherwise completely unknown. No manuscript of the Marcionite edition survived. Only critical remarks from those who had seen the publication. So it's even worse than that. We can't even touch the book, the letters of Paul. The gospel we can recreate very with high confidence, because we have so many information of people who read it and they didn't know each other. What they had in common was that they'd all seen this book, and they especially quote those things that they don't like because they're different from the canonical edition of the New Testament as we read it today as part of the Christian Bible. So, but we don't have the same documentation for the letters of Paul. So this makes it, of course, hard. And now one approach is a form critical approach. You can do genre studies. And you can look at letter collections as a genre and say, well, how good are letter collections when it comes to historical fact? And the result in antiquity will be that roughly 9 out of 10 letter collections published in antiquity are fictional. They're not written by the author they claim wrote them. This is simply a statistical observation, and I'm probably the person to I don't think there's been another person who really looked at every letter collection in antiquity, you know. And these are the statistics. So even people like Seneca, or when they write their letters, they will publish letters that are fictional, or Horatius, Ovid in Ovid. He produces letter collections, and they are in poem form. They were never in the mail. So the genre itself does not expect readers to think that they're actually authentic. Um, Also, elements like autographic, now this I write with my own hand, you know, uh, are just part of the genre. Yeah, if you use, as a poet, if you use the form of a letter, you hopefully also will have a reference that it is written by hand. You know, it's not the kind of thing, a very personal, a love letter like you know, in Ovid or so. Uh, a love letter, well, you won't dictate that to your secretary, I hope. Yeah. So looking looking at genre, at the form, Germans would call it Formkritik, form criticism, and understanding that there are certain forms, that certain genres that better be historically correct, like a lead article in the New York Times. Yeah, but if you say if a story begins, well, Putin meets Trump, yeah, and they go together to the casino, yeah, you already know this is a joke. Yeah, no, it doesn't matter how it's ended. This thing has never happened. Yeah. Um, because of the genre, you realize immediately that this is a beginning. Or once upon a time, there was a princess, and she lived in a country far, far away. And her father, you already know you're listening to a fairy tale. So this will not be historical fact. And so when you look at letter collections, simply from a statistical point of view, you must be very weary. Uh, uh, this does not mean that just because they say this is a letter, that it actually was a letter. In biblical literature in the Old Testament, you find that in Ezra and Nehemiah, where letters are quoted with it, or First Maccabees. My God, they have fun making up letters, yeah, just to prove that they're right, and that, well, to this day now, that they're really the owners of the Gaza Strip. That's what you find in First Maccabees, yeah, already. Everyone has given it to them. Um, Letters are belong really to a genre that lends itself to be fictional. Um, I'm sure Screw Tape Letters, C.S. Lewis, Goethe, you know, love stories in letter form and so. So that doesn't help us at all. At least if we don't know anything about Paul, if we have absolutely no historical thing at all from the letters of Paul, that shows that he knows something. If Paul knows that a certain, you know, who was the governor in Damascus, yeah, at a certain period, that means nothing, because this is what a poet, of course, a writer, of course, would research. He wants it to be plausible. It cannot be used as historical proof. So the letters of Paul uh, and authors who publish their own letters, yeah, redact them very carefully. In antiquity, almost contemporary of Paul, that would be people like Cicero, yeah, who during his lifetime only published two books of two collections of letters. And they were only there, they were letters of recommendation. Everyone should study the master of the style. Yeah. So he very carefully made, you know, this is not what was in the mailbox. Or Pliny, another bestseller, end of the first century. Yeah. He probably even hired people to write those letters for him, because people like to read them, like a feuilleton. So the letters of Paul in the Marcionite edition were attached to a gospel book that had been handed down as trustworthy tradition according to literary Paul. And this could be a grandiose effort of self-endorsement of the publication. The letters authenticating the gospel, and the gospel authenticating the teachings of Paul, a popular feature of edited collections of documents. Again, based on genre studies, forgeries usually authenticate something. It seems like a wild thing, but they have to forge something to say that something else is true. They're lying in order to provide proof for something else. is a very common reason for using the name of another person. Yeah, forgery is when forgery has nothing to do with truth. A forgery can actually say the truth, but the person who writes it gives authority to that particular document. And if it's not really the person that you pretend to be as you write it, then you can call it a forgery. So you, with the intent to deceive. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't want to go into it, but you can take your driver's license, for example. You can't just write a driver's license. No. The driver's license is only valid because it was issued by a very certain person or a certain institution. And if you pretend to be that institution and start printing driver's licenses, you're a forger. Yeah? Even if those people are actually know how to ride a car and actually would deserve a driver's license, doesn't matter. It's still a forgery. So it's a complicated thought even to use the word forgery. With literature, it usually does not work because readers know that they're not reading a document. A document is only valid in a single copy in the original. If you have copies, the copies have to be authenticated, so every copy becomes an original through the signature of the authenticator or whatever. But when you have a book, you're aware that probably no one has ever seen the original handwritten manuscript of the author. It's unimportant. You're with the story with it. So other rules of interpretation apply. And even when letters presented as autographs, when letters are presented as autographs, so written by the hand of the writer, like we have in Galatians or Second Thessalonians or at the end of Hebrews, then this does not mean that they must have been actually written. They just need to look like letters that were written by Paul, which they do. So none of the extra, and here comes the real observation. So you can do genre studies, yeah. Letter collections really typically are not are a great literary device. Let's put it this way. And even when they're published by the author themselves, they're heavily edited. Yeah. So they're not the authentic letters that were in the mailbox. This is what you learn. Plus, the second century literature, like the Marcionite edition, does not stand alone. We have literally 100 or more publications that we know of that were published during that period of time that are concerned with the Christian movement. They're either about Jesus or his followers. The Gospels are the easy one. I already Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, but then letters of Titus, yeah, that are not the one that's in the Bible. This is just, there's so many things in the second century that belong to this general genre that it throws a light on the end of the Gospel of John, where it says, if we publish everything that we know about Jesus, the world couldn't hold all the books that would need to be published. Here he reflects a situation. If you read that text from perspective of the second century, a reader would say, yeah, that's true. There's so much material out there. Clement of Alexandria, and you read him, he quotes all the time some kind of literature you never heard of. But that's at the end of the second century, and it was readily available. So none of these extra canonical first and second century publications of Jesus has been able to gain credibility among scholars of history. This genre is just simply a genre where people are making things up. They're making things up, or if they're not aware of it, the best case scenario is that they are publishing stories 100 years after the death of Jesus that are circulating. Yeah, this is not a historical source in this sense. So, if all the other books published about the same topics at that same time did not create credibility among scholars of history, like Gospel of Thomas might be older than the canonical Gospels. The problem here is might be. This is no home run. Yeah, this is only of interest because some people dares to say it, and you can find an argument against it. But the feeling is, it's not. I wouldn't. Yeah, we really don't know. Let's put it so. This is the scholarly thing. So Why should the Marcionite edition of the letters of Paul and his gospel book be any different than from the other books that are circulating at that time? And this is really what you need to let sink in. Yeah, the Marcionite edition is an edition that is circulating in the second century. This is where they have the feedback from the readers. This is where they've actually seen the book. Why should they know things no one else knows and have letters of Paul? Well, let it sink in. Yeah. For reasons of methodological integrity, the debate about the historical Paul and the Jesus he portrays should be carried out in the context of the elusive Marcionite edition. It might not be a great source, but it's the only thing we really have about this. So if you really think you're interested in what Paul wanted to say, and you're not just interested on how Paul was understood, I mean, literary Paul, the writings of Paul were understood in the second century, which we can say very clearly. Yeah? Then this is really the last thread where you have anything that is tangible. And I personally decided I'm not going to use my lifetime to research it because it's almost thin air. No? So still, it is the oldest tangible literary source. So my my answer, the way you phrased it, what do we know about historical Paul? I'd say, well, the only real source that we have is the Marcionite collection of the letters of Paul. The Canonical Edition, in my view, is simply a re-edited version of that. They didn't have any additional information available. So this is what we have, and this is, as far as the genre is concerned, there's no good reason for a scholar to find it historically relevant. It is historically relevant for the second century because it shows us the problems they're struggling with. Christ replacing Jesus, how does that make sense? But not for the first century, forget it. Did Paul really exist? Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but this is certainly not a source that should allow you to say, yes, he did exist. I mean, and if you can't bring anything else than that, no. Why would you even bother with that question? Did Superman exist? In the minds of people, yes, of course, Superman exists to this day, but not as a historical person. So that's how I see it. Now it's up to you, Mr. Jacob. Do you have questions? Do you have something you want me to be more specific about, or?
For those that are unfamiliar with like the difference between Marcion's letters and the canonical, which you've already discussed at great length, are they generally shorter, much shorter than the canonical counterparts?
Unfortunately, the letters are not very well documented. You know, single passages, but uh, those passages where they are, like the beginning of Colossians, where people agree that something was added. Yeah, it was always additions. It's interpolations would be the right word. So one of the really big theological differences between the Catholic Christianity that develops and Marcion was the different opinion, not just Marcion. I say Marcionite edition because this is the name that is usually given to it. But it sounds as if only the Marcionites would have read it, which is not true. It was read by many different groups that otherwise don't really feel that they're so close together. Like, there's no law of which literature we read. Just because we pick up a book and like it doesn't mean that we are like like the book is. Yeah? I can read Thomas of Aquin, and that doesn't make me a Catholic. Yeah, I'm still a Lutheran or whatever. So the the um, the thing here is, so let's say in Colossians, which is something I looked in very closely, there is a passage that portrays God as the creator of the world, and that was the issue. In the second century, the big debate among Christianity was whether the, God created the world. And the reason was they were skeptical because there's so many flaws in creation. And they just didn't want to say that God is someone who creates wisdom teeth just for the fun of it. No one needs them, and they cause a lot of pain. Yeah, and so they come up with this idea that there is an under God, an underling, demiurge, who has created the world. And this becomes an issue because the Catholic movement insists that this God, the creator of God, is the father of Jesus. Where the Marcionite community and other Gnostic, what we call Gnostic community, but Christianity, from my point of view, is a Gnostic movement. It has all the elements to get knowledge from the outside to understand what's going on. But the specifics, one of the Catholic specifics is that this is really the God who created the world, who is the Father of Jesus. So they're not going to say anything nasty about it, and how it developed. They're going to endorse the Jewish scriptures, call them the Old Testament, and so that's the history. But the Marcionite movement didn't see it that way, and so if a passage is this passage in Colossians is interpolated, and it clearly has an anti-Marcionite tendency. Yeah? And because this is how it works, you take material that is already in circulation and you edit it, and you typically have to add to it. You cannot delete it. And I can really, I mean, there are hundreds of examples like that where literature grows over time. You might be familiar with the Ignatian letters, yeah. We have seven
Yeah.
genuine letters, but we have, I think, 12 that are typically in the collection. So 5 have been added, and the genuine letters have been heavily interpolated with the same tendency that you find in the 5 additional letters. Um, the apostolic constitutions do the same trick. The pseudo Isidorian decretals, more than 10,000 documents are interpolated. Yeah, this is just a specific genre. As I said, forgeries are often done to prove that something is true, and so they forge a letter where the Pope receives the area where today the Vatican is, yeah, by Julius Caesar. It is in itself so ridiculous to forge something like that in pre-Christian time to give something to the Pope. But the tendency is clear. He wants to prove that there is a legal right of the Pope in the 10th, 11th, 12th century to be king of this particular area. And and so to answer your question from a statistical point of view, literary point of view, yes, um, the letters of found in the Marcion edition, where we can still check them, yeah, where we have enough text, are typically criticized because they're shorter. So one of the more famous ones is Origen, who says, well, in the Marcionite edition of the Letters of Rome, it ends with chapter 14. So 2 whole chapters are missing in the Marcionite edition. And which, you know, we're not talking today about New Testament as it is, but for me as an interpreter of the canonical New Testament, as my job, my profession, this is of course fantastic if you have an unedited version, if you get to their sources, yeah, and you can start to interpret these editions. And then you look at Romans 15 and 16 and answer, well, what's the role of that? Huh? What's the function? Why do they need to know that? One of the important informations in that passage is that Paul says he's not going to Rome right now from Corinth, but he goes back to Jerusalem first and delivers the money. Yeah? In the Marcionite edition, readers would never have had a clue, never have heard about a trip of Paul going back to Jerusalem, being arrested. In there, the story is told in the Marcionite edition. The story of Paul is told that from Corinth, as he planned, he went straight to Rome, writes a few other letters, and then disappears from history. Yeah, his death, of course, cannot be told in letters. He can't write a letter after he's dead. The genre will not permit that. So The chapter 15 and 16 of the letter to the Romans is added because of the editorial narrative of the canonical New Testament is very different. The book of Acts invents a story of Paul going back to Jerusalem, being arrested, and gives him the opportunity to tell the passion story of Paul, following all the clues he has from the passion story of Jesus. Yeah, he goes through the same thing. It's the Romans again who are evil. It's the Romans again who arrest them. But then Paul pulls out his passport and he's saved and goes to Rome, where he's then killed. Yeah, probably. We don't know. The Book of Acts. At the end of Book of Acts, he is actually still well and alive, and that suggests that the New Testament was published at a time where Paul was still well and alive. Yeah, it's one of those literary techniques of doing that. Um, but so if you can see, if you can identify an interpolation, um, then you can ask what's the tendency, what's the story they want to tell, and you then find this is the story of the Book of Acts. Then you must almost logically say there must be a connection. It might be the same people who did it, and and this is so understanding the Marcionite edition as an earlier form is really so valuable for the discipline of the New Testament. Yeah, for letters of Paul, but for the entire. Also, why do you have to have First and Second Peter? Because it corrects the picture that the Marcionite edition painted of Peter in Galatians. Yeah, and there Peter will say, well, Paul is a great guy, really, he just misunderstood a few things. Why do you have to say that? Because the canonical edition has as their canonical narrative the point that Paul and Peter are not enemies. They come together. It's the founding narrative, the founding legend of the Catholic Church. They even bury them in the same place. Yeah, you can't divide them. But during the Marcionite period or Gospel of Mary period, this was still very much up in the air. What I mean, still, most Christians weren't Catholic Christians at the time. The rise of the New Testament as a publication, as a successful publication, really happens only after Constantine in the 4th century. Until then, there's an enormous variety of published books on Jesus that only afterwards you start to destroy them, and one group wins the race because they have the political power behind them. You see the same thing happening in Islam later on. And so on. I mean, this is not unparalleled. The rise of the New Testament as a world bestseller, being promoted by the emperor. Josephus' book on the Jewish War is another book like that. The publisher and promoter was was the emperor of Rome who'd won that war. Yeah, of course it sells. Of course everyone had read it. Yeah, who was interested in that period. So we cannot assume, which we often do, just because we grew up in a culture where the Christian Bible is held as very true. In the 19th century, still, most scholars in Germany believe that the Old Testament was the oldest book ever written. Yeah, today it's a joke. Gilgamesh Epos, I think, like it's thousands of years older. But at that time, it was because we look at our own roots and somehow being too critical about them also questions our own identity. And this is what you see here. So again, yes, where we can check it, yes, the Marcionite edition is shorter. But this would be a completely different topic if we would want to see what was changed to create the New Testament. This is not very difficult to do if you accept the priority of Marcionite edition to the canonical edition. It's a great exercise to do in class with people who, for the very first time, read the New Testament. You don't need to be a saint or holy or pray a lot or so. It's rather obvious. One of the things that the canonical edition does is they want to make sure that you understand that everything that's in the New Testament, everything that Jesus prophesied, is a fulfillment of something that you read in the first part of the Christian Bible, the Old Testament. This is not on the mind of Marcion or on the Marcionite edition. They don't care about that. This is not one of the themes that are important. And so people like Irenaeus would say he cut it out. No, he didn't cut it out. He just didn't care about it. And the Canonical Edition put that in everywhere they possibly could. In the out of the Gospel of Marcion, the Marcionite Gospel becomes the Gospel of Luke, and there were exactly enough. If you take the 50% was added, so if you take the Gospel of Luke, 2/3 are from the Gospel of Marcion, and a third was added. But if you just have the Gospel of Marcion and you measure how much text was added, it would be about half of the amount that's in the Gospel of Marcion. So the first two chapters are complete editions, so that where Luke sits down and writes to Theophilus why he writes this whole book, yeah, and then he read his competition, Mark and Matthew, probably because it's printed just before that, yeah, and he wasn't quite in agreement. And then the birth of Jesus and the shepherds and the angels coming, his circumcision. He can look into the heart of God and the prayers of people. He knows what the angel says. And so these are all, this is not what Gospel of Marcion reads like. This is much more straightforward storytelling. So the canonical edition then uses this old thing and tries to put it together, and they clearly have an agenda. It is um, the the story of how the Catholic movement came to be, and the Catholic movement became mainstream Christianity and has dominated everything until the 16th century, where the larger offsprings like Protestants so made changes, but they also completely bought into this early narrative of how Christianity was born. It's fictional. It's a fabrication. If all we have is
And
this, the Marcionite edition, as a historian, not as a believer or anything, you just really have to say, I'm sorry, we don't have much to go by as far as historically is concerned. We learn much more from Josephus than we would learn from Marcionite edition about the first century.
in my final question, are you basically saying that the Marcionite edition of Paul's letters were basically either created or is an edited form of what may have existed about from an
Um,
earlier collection that
well,
can't be proven either, but to
yeah, well,
reformulate Paul's
yeah,
letters around Marcion's gospel?
so what I'm trying to say is this is all that we have, and um, cannot never be a clear basis that everything that's written there has actually happened or was written by a particular person. Um, it's the genre doesn't allow it. It's like the joke between Putin and Trump.
Hmm.
The genre does not allow a serious historian to say, yeah, now I can write the biography of Paul from these letters. No, I mean there are literally thousands of letters. Yeah, I mean there are more than 100 letter collections in antiquity that were published in antiquity, and some have published more than one. And uh, uh, 200 authors, you can check that. You can understand that this is a genre that has to be treated with, if all you're interested in is history, yeah, historical fact about the time they're supposed, yeah, to cover, not the time when they were written, but the time they were supposed to cover. Because many letters are fictional in the sense that they take a fictional character from the past and let him write. It was a standard rhetorical exercise in education and mimesis. Yeah? You um, give a modern example. Yeah, in order to see if you understand Plato right, your exercise could be, you have 2 hours. Please write a treatise of Plato about nuclear power plants. You give them a topic that has nothing to do with his time, because all you're trying to check is whether you understood how Plato thinks. Huh? And when you find a collection like that later on, you, as a serious scholar, immediately first have to ask: Is this like an exercise? Yeah? Is this a writer having a lot of fun? Yeah. So like Gulliver's Trips, Gulliver's Travels, or so, something like that. Just because it's written down doesn't mean that they're places where you have tall people or tiny people or so. Or is it? Yeah, it's not documents. No one likes to read text. Yeah, document is, for example, a tax receipt. No one likes to read tax receipts. Um, so that's what we have. So anyone who will, and here's the problem. Really, it wouldn't be much of an issue if it weren't so basic for the discipline of New Testament scholarship, because um, in the 20th century, we've become really weary about Jesus. We don't know too much about him. And then you have historical Jesus movement and the Jesus seminar, and we go back. We always come up at the end with a solution. There is no really sound basis methodologically on being sure about it. It just doesn't work. But with Paul, this has never happened. You go and read a commentary on any commentary on the letter to the Romans, specifically with the theological person in mind. They really read this letter as if it had been in the mail that way. There's absolutely not even an inkling of understanding that big parts of that letter may have been inserted later on. If you're familiar with, I mean, the Dresdner school, as I call it, there are several dissertations, and they have statements like Galatians chapter 4 was not in the first draft of Galatians, or Romans whole chapters 5 and 6. I don't, I'm not quite sure what it is. I can't give you the exact quotes or so. We're not there in the Marcionite edition. How in the world can a colleague of mine write a commentary about letter to the Romans and constantly write about theology of Paul? Yeah? You don't know if this is Paul. If you do it as literature, you can do it. Yeah, you can say in a canonical edition, Paul is very consistent about this and this and this concept, but you're probably going to talk about a theological concept of the middle of the 2nd century. The whole idea that there's a family, there's up there is God there in heaven, and they have a lot of little gods around him, a big family, and one of the sons are sent down, which is the Gnostic myth, comes down and provides human beings with some kind of an insight, and then returns again. And if you live according to this teaching, you will have eternal life at the end. This is pretty much also the myth for the Christian movement. I can see a lot of individual, of course, differences, but not in the main storyline. Do you really think that a rabbi in the 1st century traveling through Galilee would have the sense that he's one of those children of God that left the pantheon to go down on earth? Yeah. This seems, just from the traditional Jewish background, a really wild assumption. And yet, in New Testament discipline, you can say that and you get away with it all the time. And the reason for that is Paul, because they think, yeah, maybe we don't know as much as we did about the Gospels as 200 years ago. We knew everything about Jesus. We don't know that anymore. But about Paul, yes, we know that only 7 writings are genuine. Really? How would you know that? Huh? Because you decide what Paul thinks, you know that ahead of time, but basically you treat them as letters that were in the mailbox. And you wouldn't do it with Seneca, you wouldn't do it with Cicero. But with Paul, you can do it and get away with it, and that must stop. That just simply must stop. Hmm? And in this case, the pointing out that what we have in the Canonical Edition is a heavily edited version that added the Gospel, that added 4 letters straight out, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Hebrews, has never been questioned. Those were not part of the. Who took out the address to the Laodiceans and called it to the Ephesians, so they could have a little more editing opportunity in there. And Ephesus was important. This is where bishops like Bishop Polycarp and Onesimus and so came from, who are also characters in the letters of Paul. Onesimus shows up in Philemon. You would like to have Ephesus in there. Ephesus is the place where we found miraculously, through a super discovery, the original manuscript that Saint John wrote, and out of which an editor then makes the Gospel of John, saying, "We have this book; it is written by the one we can trust. Here it is, and I'll also give you my commentary with it." And so we have. No one interprets the Gospel of John as if this was the disciple who writes it. Yeah, although this is how it presents itself. Yeah. To the reader, yeah, we have, if you read the beginning, the introduction, and the end of the Gospel of John, like chapter 21, as an editorial, a comment by those who produced the printed version, so to say, the published version of a manuscript that they found, then you realize it's a different literature than what is usually interpreted in commentaries of the New Testament. And I'm not the only one who feels that way, but it becomes really difficult for us to just have a thoughtful conversation, because this is not Paul what you're reading there in Romans 8. I'm a Lutheran, so Romans chapter 8 is extremely important. Yeah, the faith. You go to heaven by faith, not through deeds. Yeah? So it's but it has nothing to do with Paul. It's still valid as a thought. Yeah. It's been enormously impactful in the 16th, 17th century. Thousands and thousands of people have died for that doctrine, yeah. But it has nothing to do with the person who's called Paul, or I can't even be sure about that. Of course, I can't be, but I can be sure that we shouldn't be sure that it was written by Paul. I can be absolutely sure that the probability is absolutely minimal. That a person existed who wrote those letters and had consistent thought processes. I could go on forever in this way. Yes, Paul is really important for us, but only 7 letters. You can't pass your exam in Germany if you can't name those 7 letters that are genuine. Why? It's ridiculous. As we, as scholars, New Testament discipline, are really perpetrators here, and this must stop.
Well, thank you very much for joining me today, David Trobisch.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.